All right, so we're going to start here just by sort of noting that the question about whether or not someone is alive or that death has occurred is not a straightforward sort of scientific question. We're not trying to sort of answer this question in the biological sense, but we are trying to answer a moral question here. And to kind of drive this home, I want to reference the introductory passage that the editors have included with this section, where they talk a little bit about why this is to be understood as a moral question and not strictly a scientific one. So here's what they say about death. They say death marks the point at which medical treatment can be unilaterally withdrawn, organs harvested and properly disposed of, the body buried or cremated, the surviving spouse can legally remarry, and so forth. If death is an ethically and legally significant boundary, after which it is permissible to do things that it is not permissible to do before, then we need a moral argument for this, for where this boundary should be drawn. So I think this is important, and as we go forward, we're going to try to make some distinctions that I think will sort of eventually get us to the moral argument, but at the same time sort of recognize that there are these sort of other things that we need to think about as we read through this material and try to make sense of where the disagreements are. Okay, so the first distinction then, and again, this is going to sort of come along with this, whether the moral question is being answered or the scientific question is being answered, or what the relationship is between the two, is this distinction between sort of the death of the person and the death of the organism. So to start, let's just distinguish, well, what do we mean by sort of the person, and how is that sort of different from or potentially different from the organism? So the person, as we sort of read through this sort of material, is going to be sort of the experiencing consciousness or the mind, and this is going to include, you know, thoughts and feelings and emotions and memories, and you know, everything that sort of comes along with the working of our body, or with our living body, but may of course sort of be distinct with it. And so the organism could be sort of understood as the body in which the consciousness resides. So there's my organs, my limbs, my heart, and my brain. And all of these things sort of keep me going, and for the most parts, we're very sort of tied to each other. Right? The person, the organism, were thought to be sort of one and the same, right? So if you lose, you know, if your heart stops beating and your lungs start breathing and your brain stops thinking, well, then there will be no experiencing consciousness. And you know, we thought that, well, you only have one if and only if you have the other. But the issue is that with advancements in medical technology, we've allowed these sort of concepts to kind of come apart, which is to say that in the most common situation that we tend to sort of worry about is a situation in which, you know, more or less the organism is going, the body is there, and the organs are working, and so on and so forth, but there is no consciousness, and not just that there is no consciousness, but there's no longer even the possibility of a consciousness, right? This is like the persisted vegetative state in which, you know, we might say that the organism is alive, but the person is no longer there, and the person will sort of no longer be there. And this is, I think, where the debate becomes important for the moral question, right? To think in terms of, well, how should we understand death for the purposes of saying, answering questions about organ harvesting and whether or not a spouse can remarry and move on, and whether or not we can redirect precious medical resources to another individual. So anyway, so different conceptions of death are going to be sort of mentioned here, and we want to think about whether or not they're sort of adequate for the task at hand. So I just want to sort of mention sort of three that seem to sort of come up, and how they kind of relate to this person versus organism debate. We'll start first with the one that is I guess the most rejected, which is the cardiopulmonary definition of death, which is this idea that, well, if your lungs and heart stop working, then the organism is dead, or the person is dead. And I think that for both at the organism level and at the person level, this isn't going to work, in part because of our sufficient advancement in medical technology that we have right now, the medical technology to keep the person going, even in the absence of their heart working or their lungs working, right? So we have ways to artificially simulate the functions of the heart and the lungs, such that we could say that even at the level of organism, that the person is alive, and of course at the level of personhood, right? If the brain is going, then the person is still there. So this then sort of has sort of precipitated this move to talking about brain death at both sort of the person level and the organism level. And there's sort of two ways you could go here. One is with the whole brain conception, which essentially says that the entire brain needs to be working, which includes the higher level functions of the cerebrum, and the lower level functions, like that of the brain stem. And to have sort of a whole brain conception seems to say, at the very least, that it's sufficient that with whole brain death you're going to lose the person, but not sort of uh, not sort of necessary, right? That you could lose the person even without whole brain death, which is to say that if the higher level functions are gone, but the brainstem functions are there, the person may be lost, but not maybe the organism. So that's where things get kind of muddy. Because the cortical higher brain definition is more kind of related to the personhood debate, which is to say the experiencing consciousness, and so their definition of death would say, you have the absence of the person, and the person is dead, but the organism may be still alive. So for people who are arguing against this higher brain conception or this personhood conception, they basically say that it's not really death, right? If the organism is alive, it seems sort of weird to say that death has occurred. And so again, there's this kind of question about sort of, well, where's the moral line to be drawn, right? I mean, if we're kind of talking past each other, we really need to know what it is that matters, right? For the moral question, should we be thinking in terms of persons, or should we be thinking in terms of organisms, right? Should we be thinking about whether or not there's a consciousness there, or whether or not the organism is alive? Okay, so now we see that there's this need to kind of figure out what conception of death we should be working with, right? Should we be thinking in terms of the person, in which case the higher brain conception is going to make sort of more sense, or should we be thinking at sort of the level of organism, in which case the higher brain conception doesn't make as much sense, right? Maybe the whole brain conception or the cardiopulmonary conception would be more in line with the death of the organism. So I want to bring up sort of McMahon here for a minute, just to kind of sort of point to why it is you want to think that maybe from at the moral level, it doesn't really make sense to be talking about the death of the organism, and it makes more sense to make sense of the death of the person. And this has to do with how we should understand ourselves as existing, right? When is it that we sort of exist or cease to exist? Uh, and this is a question of sort of personal identity, but it's a question that is importantly sort of relevant to this discussion. And the thing that's good about McMahon is he makes two arguments that I think are worthy of consideration, and they're arguments that can be sort of represented in sort of a valid form, such that if you disagree with them or that they could fail only if you find something problematic about one or more of the premises. So I'm going to start with the first argument, which is more sort of science fiction-y. It's kind of based in this idea that if modern medicine becomes sort of sufficiently advanced, then in principle we could find ourselves in this kind of situation. So the first premise of this argument can be stated as sort of a straightforward conditional, that if I can in principle exist separately from the organism that is now mine, so if I could exist without my body, like my brain stem and my hearts and lungs and so on and so forth, then I am not identical with it. And so what he says is that, well, I can in principle exist separately from the organism that is now mine. So he imagines, a procedure, a brain transplant procedure by which you remove the sort of the higher brain from the organism, and the organism sort of sits there idling, right, in sort of a persistive vegetative state, right, where the lower brain functions are still going, and the heart's still beating, and the lungs are still breathing, and so on and so forth. But the higher brain is transplanted into another body, a different organism. And the question then becomes is, well, would I still exist, right? And the intuition here is, well, yeah, you still exist, but you exist over there. You exist in the new body, and you no longer reside in your old body. So there's this idea is that, well, then I can, right? I can in principle exist separately from my old body, and from these two premises, then you get that I am not identical with the organism, right? I'm not identical with these lower brain functions and the respiration of my lungs and the beating of my heart and the circulation of my blood. So that's sort of argument one, and that's kind of science fiction-y, and people might have problem with it being so speculative. So his second argument is is placed in a real world sort of scenario, which is dicephaly. So if someone is dicephalic, it is an organism with sort of two heads, and there have been sort of humans who are born sort of dicephalic, where you have twins who are sharing the same body. So you have two heads and two minds, but sort of one body, right? So two consciousnesses that we would say are distinct from each other, right? They're not the same. Those consciousness, they're two people, and that are not identical with each other. But if that's true, then they can't be identical with their body, right? They can't both be identical with their body if they aren't identical with each other. This is the transitivity of identity, right? So if x equals y and z equals y, then x and z have to equal to each other. So it's just a law of identity that most logicians sort of accept. So if that's true, so this is the second premise, then there's only kind of two ways you can get out of this, right? If they can't be identical with each other, but you want to maintain identity with an organism, or if you want to understand identity with the organism, then either one of those twins is identical with the organism and not the other, or neither are identical with the organism, right? So that seems to be the only two options left over, that they can't both be identical, then either one of them is identical and not the other, and that, or neither are identical. But we seem to have some reason to think that it's not the case that one twin can be identical with the organism but not the other, since both have the same relationship with the body. And if that's true, then neither twins are identical with the organism, right? Neither twins are identical with the organism. And then we can add here to this argument that, well, if neither twins are identical with the organism, and we, who are not dicephalic twins, but monocephalic, we who are essentially the same kind of thing as these dicephalic twins, right, at the level of consciousness and being, then since we're the same thing as these twins, then neither are we sort of identical with the organisms that are now ours. So in both cases, we have this argument that ends with we are not identical with the organism. And so the conception that we're dealing with, at least from McMahon's point of view, should be at the level of consciousness, right? It should be at the level of personhood instead of at the level of sort of organism, at least for the moral argument. Okay, so we have, this debate about sort of conceptions, but the other thing that we need to kind of talk about is where things sort of come apart, right? There's the metaphysical conception that we want to deal with, or that we want to understand, or that we want to determine, and then the epistemological criteria for these things. And so it's possible that, well, even if we settle on a conception that's appropriate for these sort of moral debates, there may be a difficulty with the epistemology behind sort of what's going on. So at one level, and I'm thinking about the stuff on the left here, the metaphysical conception is about sort of what is, but the epistemological conception is sort of knowing what is. So there's this question of, well, what measures or criteria do we have for determining one kind of death versus another, and do we have an adequate way to reliably predict whether or not somebody is whole brain dead, or higher brain dead, or cardiopulmonary dead? I mean, these things are a part of the question, because if we want to implement these things, or if we want to sort of make decisions, then there is this sort of empirical question, right? There is this these empirical measures that are going to sort of come out of the conception that we're dealing with. And so in a lot of the reading that you're going to find, there is this question about the epistemological sort of certitude that we have with regards to these different conceptions. And that's going to make an issue about what sorts of decisions that we make, either at the personal level or at the policy level. So the last thing that we need to think about is the distinction between sort of setting public policy about these decisions and the uh, epistemological measures that we use and uh, the conceptual definitions that we decide upon. And um, and there is this sort of distinction between sort of the how we would act under certain conditions or what we think would be sort of right for us, and then what would be sort of appropriate public policy. So I want to start just with a couple of concerns about at the policy level. Um, uh, so at one level, you might say that the whole brain or especially the cardiopulmonary definitions may be sort of too restrictive a definition of death. Uh, and the concern here is that if we're just sort of keeping a body alive and there's no person there, right, there's no sort of consciousness, then it's possible that we're just kind of wasting resources, right? So maybe we're wasting ventilators and ICU space, or maybe we're wasting organs, right? This is a question that keeps on coming up about the use, when is it sort of appropriate to harvest organs from another person, and if our definition is too restrictive at the policy level, then we're in the sort of concerning area of sort of wasted resources. On the other hand, though, if we go the cortical or sort of higher brain route, there is this concern that we're potentially sort of being too broad, or if we're not too broad now, we may find ourselves on a slippery slope to sort of even broader and broader definitions, such that we move away from a person being completely gone to a person being sort of not much there, and the concern that some people have is that, if we get down this road, we're going to start harvesting organs of people who are maybe not permanently unconscious, or people who are only sort of semi-conscious, and there's this concern that at the policy level, the line is just getting too muddy for their um, for their comfort, and they worry that we will eventually get to a place where we're harvesting organs from people that we shouldn't. So that's the policy question, but there's also your own sort of personal decisions that you need to sort of think about. Um, and so one thing that you want to think about that is at the personal level, uh, when would you be okay, or when would you think with perfect assurance of your state that people would be able to stop care or to remove your organs, or for your spouse to remarry or whatever. Um, at what conceptual level for you would you say that you sort of cease to exist, right? Are you sort of no longer there, such that these things could be sort of done with your body? And then think about, well, how, and this is sort of more at the measuring level or the epistemological level, how comfortable are you with the state of science right now in the reliability of determining where that line is? Like, how reliable are the tests we have for determining when you cease to exist? Um, and so that's something you want to think about too, because again, this is also part of the question. But again, it separates the sort of conceptual piece from the epistemological piece, and I think that's important to do as we sort of read through these readings for this section, and as we sort of think about sort of what is the morally appropriate way to sort of go forward. So I think with that set out, we can have our discussion without equivocating sort of too much, without going back and forth between these sort of different ways of thinking.